Well, hello there, and welcome to another episode of Regarding Men, where we hold men in high regard. I think this is episode, I don't know what it is, 58 perhaps? Is that right? Or 59?
50 something. We'll
Something
figure
like
it out.
that,
Whatever
in the high
number's there.
50s.
Yeah.
Like Jack Benny, I'm 50 something.
Yeah.
50 something. And we're going to talk about, I'm Janice Fiamengo. I'm joined by Paul Elam and Tom Golden. And we're going to be speaking today about two issues in both cases where I guess we can say that I was going to say that the slogan "never let a good crisis go to waste" applies in both cases. Maybe it's more accurate to say that the gynocentrism of our society and societies worldwide is on display during COVID-19, as we expected it would be, and that the indifference, even the active hostility towards men, is also very sadly revealed in these two articles that we're going to talk about. One of the articles is an NBC article. The title is "Stimulus Check Won't Be in the Mail for Americans Who Owe Child Support." And this is really staggering article about the fact that the stimulus bill that President Trump signed into law on Friday, I believe, exempts limitations on people who might owe the government, past due taxes. They'll still be eligible for the stimulus check if they meet the other criteria. It's not going to penalize those who are way overdue in their, university loan payments or heavily in debt there. They'll still be eligible if they meet the other criteria. But it seems like the one category of person whose check will be withheld are those who owe child support. And this is back payments. On the surface, for somebody who doesn't know anything about this subject, that might seem reasonable. I guess, hey, there's a child starving somewhere because a deadbeat dad isn't making his payment. But in fact, there are all sorts of situations where somebody could have been making payments all along. This is mostly men, but not exclusively men, who could fall into this category. But for whatever reason, they've fallen into arrears. It's very difficult to get out of arrears once you've fallen into them. It's easy to fall into them as well. This could be cases where the children are now adults, and yet this parent, as I say, mostly fathers, but not entirely, is going to be denied the check because of those arrears. It's really quite startling. So we'll talk about that. And we also want to talk about another article, and this in a way extends a conversation that we had last week about the COVID-19 crisis and the claim being made by feminists now that there's a marked rise in domestic violence as a result. And the particular article that caught our attention this week came out on March 28th. It's in the Guardian newspaper, our favorite feminist paper, which is titled "Lockdowns Around the World Bring Rise in Domestic Violence."
Of course.
It, alleges that everywhere, whether it's Greece or Brazil or Spain or China or wherever you look, there is this massive increase in domestic violence. The evidence for that is pretty slim. Of course, we'll talk about the basis for these claims. The discussions by various feminist authorities in different countries always focus exclusively on women and children suffering from domestic violence, even though feminists' own data clearly shows that men make up a significant number of domestic violence victims. Even in some studies, the majority of domestic violence victims, and yet it's as if men don't exist. And there are all sorts of calls being made now by feminist activists in countries around the world for special measures to protect women and to punish male perpetrators, even outrageous ones, such as having perpetrators, as they are called, locked out of their homes for the duration of the pandemic. Almost unbelievable. So and we'll get into that discussion in a bit as well. So so here we are. I've had many hopeful friends say to me, let's hope that during this crisis, men and women can come together. Maybe the gender war can be called off, at least for the time being, so that we can come together to fight this particular crisis. Doesn't seem to be happening at all. In fact, the opposite. It seems as if the gender war is being ramped up. Pretty disturbing.
Yes.
Business as usual in the United States with the child support industry. One of the, this story bothered me. I get a lot of these stories, and of course people write me a lot and tell me about some of the horrors that are happening in their lives because they lost a job or got injured or got ill and couldn't pay their child support, and the courts and the system acting like a mafia, saying, I don't care. So too bad what happened to you, pay up or go to jail. Get the money, borrow it, steal it, do whatever you have to do, but pay the money. And I look at all there was actually some compassion in this. Normally in the United States, if you owe arrears in income tax, the government they'll take your Social Security check in order to collect that money. Normally it's a very vicious industry, but they've suspended that for the sake of getting food money to people who need it. And here we have, hundreds of thousands, now millions of fathers out of work. It was one of the first casualties of the coronavirus was employment. And so imagine how many men are now going to be in arrears at the time the checks go out because they don't have the money to pay. And of course the government's attitude, well, if you're a father, so it's you being responsible for this, and if you don't eat, you don't eat. It's absolutely stunningly heartless. And I've got to say is that I don't normally, and I talk a lot more about men's accountability for this, for the problems that they have, the way they participate with their own internal misandry and their gynocentrism. But I can just imagine now there's going to be millions and millions of women taking these checks that have come from the government that were supposed to go to their exes, who now won't have food money, and gleefully putting this in the bank and spending it. The whole scenario is just absolutely disgusting to me.
Yeah, I agree. In fact, the whole scenario of separating fathers from their families is just unbelievable. I mean, imagine watching a movie, a sci-fi movie about a planet where the governing forces in the planet took natural families of these aliens and separated out some people and kept other people in, and there was huge pain caused by that. Mm-hmm. What would you think of that culture? I'd think they were assholes, Yeah. Well, if you look at us, we're doing the same thing. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's crazy. It's absolutely insane.
Yeah. And forcing those who are separated and who have endured all of this terrible pain, maybe one of the worst kinds of emotional pain that a parent can experience, and forcing them to pay for it.
Really.
On penalty of going to jail.
Yep.
It's amazing.
It's absolutely insane. I ran into a quote from Stephen Baskerville's book, Taken into Custody, which is a great book, by the way, on this whole topic. Yeah. Quote goes like this: "No known government, however brutal or tyrannical, has ever denied, in fact or principle, the fundamental claim of parents to their children. A government that distributed children randomly could not be other than tyrannical." And that was not Stephen's quote. That was a quote that he used in the book, and I forget, Shelley somebody. But that says it all. Yeah. I mean, this is tyranny, and yet we see it as normal.
Yeah.
We see this whole thing about people being separated from their families as being something normal because it's a black robe that does it.
Yeah.
Literally, this shit is crazy.
It is.
And it's even crazier that we won't give money now to the the group that,
Yeah.
and what's up with that? And what's up with that is that both the Republicans and the Democrats hate fathers who don't pay their child support.
Or just don't give a damn about them.
Well,
yeah.
no,
It's all about getting the women's vote.
Yes,
Yeah.
they get jelly beans for hating them.
Yeah.
It's like,
It's really disturbing. It sure
think it
as
was
hell is.
Mark Twain said, he said that, if Congress, if both Republicans and Democrats hate something, then that is proof that they're both wrong,
And plus, we have to remember, this is probably the only time in human history that you can live in abject poverty and be morbidly obese at the same time.
Not the truth.
We have programs like WIC, which stands for Women, Infants, and Children. Who's missing from that picture? It's a food program. Gee, oh yeah, man. We have abundance of federal support and food banks and all manner. Nobody's going to starve in this situation. Certainly not a woman with children. It's not going to happen.
Right.
And it's still not enough.
It's not enough.
This is the most egregious example of male disposability I think I've seen so far. I mean, it doesn't quite compare maybe to combat in some ways in illicit wars, but in terms of what we do internally to our own population, this is just like, oh, by the way, and it's telling your children, your dad doesn't need to eat.
Right.
Too bad for him. He shouldn't have pissed mommy off.
Yeah. And men are of course going to be uniquely vulnerable during this crisis as a result of the economic disaster that is befalling all of us, but particularly falls on men. Men are the majority of business owners, and those are the ones that are being hardest hit. Women are the majority of government employees. Their jobs in government certainly tend to be much more stable. Their paychecks are guaranteed. Men, of course, are evaluated by women, by society in general, much more strongly as wage earners, job creators, providers, producers, all of those things, success objects, as I think Warren Farrell called them. So the emotional and psychological as well as material impact on men is heightened. I mean, of course, there are knock-on effects for women, and women. This is not to say that women aren't affected too, of course, but to deny how hard hit men are going to be by this economic disaster is foolishness. And then to add this on top of everything else, the indignity, the slap in the face, the clear statement of societal indifference is really just, it is staggering. And as you say, both of you, that this has been going on in various forms for years and years and years and is accepted as normal. Stephen Baskerville has documented the craziness of it, really articulately and powerfully. He's talked about cases where I think it was a man who had been held as a prisoner of war in Iraq for 5 months, came home from that and was hit with a huge bill for the child support that he hadn't been able to pay while he was a prisoner of war. He talked about the case of a janitor who had been on death row for 10 years and was finally exonerated. And when he got out of jail, he was immediately hit, but with a $50,000 order for child support that he hadn't been able to pay while he was on death row. He talks about the cases of, young teenagers who had been statutorily raped and were forced to pay child support to the women who had raped them. And, he goes on and on and on. I mean, it is hideous, a massive system of surveillance and enforcement to follow these men, to prevent them from moving on with their lives if they've fallen into arrears, to prevent them from getting any kind of assistance, to prevent them from living normally. It is really, if you were a visitor from outer space, you'd really have to wonder at what kind of a society would do that to its men, to its fathers.
A society that's suicidal in many ways, it appears to me. And I think
agree.
Often, and I probably get criticized for this, but The fact is, when you read in the newspaper or online these days about some father that's holed up in an apartment with his kids and a gun, threatening to take them all out, or God forbid does something like that, as a society, we tend to react by saying, oh, there's more evidence of men's violence or this crazed lunatic. Right. And we don't want to look at the fact that this probably is just another guy pushed to the edge by a system that has ground him up and spit him out. Yes. like nothing about his life mattered. Yes. And this happens a lot, and we are going to see violence from the weaker among men who can't handle this kind of pressure and don't have the coping skills for it. They'll act out, and most of them are at least courteous enough to kill themselves quietly.
They kill themselves, yeah, instead of others.
But sometimes they blow up and kill others, and then we're all just absolutely shocked and offended at what could, what happened, and we made it happen.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Society makes it happen.
And you can contrast your story, Paul, with stories about women who kill all of their children. And of course, in those cases, it's, oh, there's mental health problems, or they were abused as children. It's like it's just such a contrast between the two.
Or, as we've seen in some cases, they were abused by the man in their lives, of course.
Of course.
That's why she had to shoot him in the back with a shotgun while he was asleep.
While he was asleep, really. Yeah. And don't even think about putting her in prison for that.
Exactly. Yeah. Mm-hmm. No woman should be in prison.
Yeah, what she did was justified. Yeah. But even to suggest that a man had reasons for committing a horrific act of violence is seen as just utterly sacrilegious. The outrage that comes to anybody that makes that suggestion is, again, proof of the massive denial and dehumanization of men in our society. It's very, very
and the
disturbing.
Fathers who don't pay child support have that even more. It's just in spades. I mean, it's okay to hate men. We know that from the Washington Post, but it's really a good thing to hate these deadbeat dads. Mm-hmm. No one really knows why they're not paying.
And what's really funny is, and not so funny actually, and we'll provide links below, women who are ordered to pay child support are less likely to pay it than men are. That's the absolute truth. I did some research on that. We'll get you some links in there. Women are less likely, but we didn't coin the term deadbeat moms.
Mm-hmm. No.
Nobody ever heard of saying anything like a deadbeat mom.
That's right.
And a lot of times we have men, and unfortunately, this is where I go back to male complicity in this. Guys won't complain when the ex-wife doesn't pay the child support.
They don't through it.
They don't hold her feet to the fire because you certainly can't. Oh my God, if you press the matter, she might end up going to jail with all the men that go to jail for this.
Mm-hmm. No, it is. It's really it's such a clear example of cultural misandry. It is so it's just startling, and most men do pay if they possibly can. Like the compliance rate is something like between 85 and 90%. And the men who don't pay, this idea we have, these men don't care about the welfare of their children, that they're indifferent, they're off spending it on, fancy cars and women or something. I mean, it's just so
Cuban cigars.
It's so cruel. The reality is, of course, that many men the vast majority of divorces are initiated by women, often because their men have fallen on hard times and are no longer desirable as mates. So often it's because they're unemployed or underemployed. They don't have money to begin with. They end up spending a lot of money on a lawyer so that maybe they can still be involved in their children's lives at all. Then they're kicked out of the family home. They got to set up another household that's half decent so that their children will be able to visit them. They have huge, huge expenditures at a time when they probably have very little money, if any at all. So it's really easy to fall behind when those child support payments start coming due.
Amen.
And to think that that is some kind of evidence that these men deserve to be shamed and punished and excoriated by the society is really shows a an utter indifference to these men's
I
lives.
think it was Baskerville that said they're not dead beats, they're just dead broke.
Yeah,
And,
yeah,
yes,
very well
exactly
said.
right.
And that's what happens during, we find in studies about divorce is that what tends to happen is that both parties in the divorce live at a lower socioeconomic level post-divorce than they lived at during the marriage.
Yes.
It's also interesting that most divorces come in at 6 to 7 years into the marriage. That's the mean age or duration of the marriage. That also happens to coincide with where men hit their peak income.
Huh.
And so when their income potential has capped in men, women tend to file divorce at that time. Plus they've coined a phrase for children, like the first one is called the insurance policy. This is to ensure women are actually using this to describe their children, because that's what it gets them automatic guaranteed access to income post-divorce. So the first one's the insurance policy. Second one's more. And so what happens is when the potential to have as much, if we look at Briffault's law, where there is no benefit to women, and I don't believe that this is as hard and fast as some do, but in many cases where there's no benefit to the woman perceived, she has no use for the man. And so if she can get nearly as much out of the divorce as she would out of the marriage, she'll opt for the divorce. That happens, and it happens a lot. And then our society moves in to crush the guy once it's all over.
Exactly.
With onerous debt and all kinds of other abuse and mistreatment. We live in a horrible system.
And a unified voice. I mean, everyone can't stand these deadbeat dads.
Right.
And this episode is probably a voice in the dark of, standing up for these guys that aren't paying their child support. I mean, you rarely will hear that. Ugh.
Yeah.
Oh no! I mean, that's a certainly. Wait, can you imagine a politician standing up and saying we need to do something to help post-divorce fathers?
Man,
we're crushing them with child support and treating them like chattel, and this needs to stop.
Not going to happen, I guess.
End of career.
Yeah, I mean, I in a way though, I can see a way one could do it that might even be effective. I was looking at a website of somebody who was talking about this fact that the stimulus checks will not go to anybody in arrears and child support. There were a lot of angry women writing in because women are also impacted. Some women themselves owe from, years ago, and they explained the circumstances and everything. A lot of women are married to guys who are paying child support. And often they file what's it called now, a joint tax return.
Right.
So they were wondering they're linked as like one person in a way financially. So they're worried that the check's not going to come to their household, or at least is going to be significantly reduced because the husband is listed as in arrears. And, there's all sorts of ways that lots of people, aside from the supposed deadbeat dad, is impacted by the cruelty and indifference of this move. And I think there would be a way to have, some kind of bipartisan pushback against the cultural malice towards the supposed deadbeat dad. And it deserves a questioning of the term. And I think a lot of women would be interested in it too, if somebody would just have the guts and the conviction and the knowledge to actually pursue it and explain the situations that can arise and explain how totally unfair it is. But but people can't.
And we know all the media and the pundits would treat them very kindly.
Yeah, I know, you're right. Yeah, it would be very difficult. It's true. It would be very difficult. But yeah, it's terrible. It really just
left and
enraging.
Right.
Yeah.
Go after him.
Yeah, really disappointed in Trump, particularly for doing this. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and it would have been, unfortunately, I mean, I get one thing, that it would be a suicidal hill to die on over the stimulus package.
Yeah.
Yes.
or the rescue package, as they're preferring it be called. Socially, it's just, we're not there. And I'm disappointed. I mean, I'm disappointed some of the revisions in the tax policy from Trump used to allow fathers to write off alimony, and that was taken from them in the tax overhaul.
Huh.
And you know, I guess they had to find the money for somewhere. But this is just goes to show you. I'm a conservative, and I view Republicans with the utmost suspicion, because they are just as complicit in this stuff as anybody on the left.
Yes.
Yeah, that's for sure.
This is a societal problem. We get the politicians we elect for a reason.
Why can't we hate men?
Yeah.
You know, there you go.
Yeah, and so to turn to the other subject, if we're ready to do so, there's another example of just craven indifference. Men absolutely erased from the discourse of compassion or concern. This article in The Guardian about the spike in domestic violence as a result of the coronavirus crisis, it goes right to, I mean, there's no gender neutral language at all. It goes immediately. Every single person who is spoken to and quoted from talks about women suffering, women enduring the hell of gender-based violence. They even say that. They even call it gender-based violence. This is so horrific, and we must take greater measures during this period to protect these women, to eject the perpetrators from the home, get them out. It's unbelievable. You know, I mean, I've looked at feminist studies. Even feminist studies will say that, you know, 2 out of 5, 1 out of 3 victims of domestic violence is male. And suddenly that melts away. I mean, and I don't think that that's actually true. Much more responsible surveys will show that men report being hit and being attacked with objects, etc., at about equal the rate, sometimes even more.
Yes.
So how that can be completely elided, all of a sudden male victims are not even theoretically referred to in the discussion. And all we have is various activists and even one particular judge in Italy quoted in this article calling to get the men out of the homes, get them out for the whole duration of the pandemic. And you can imagine all sorts of situations where, yeah, I can imagine, as we've said before, lots of fights are going to be erupted during this terrible time because of the incredible stress and fearfulness and everything else. So I can imagine the women who are going to be calling the police. They've made special measures in many cases where women can go to police. They can leave their homes even if nobody else can, to go to police to report domestic violence. They can get the guy out of the house. What's he supposed to do during this time? Where is he supposed to go? I mean,
he's likely unemployed too.
For sure he is. Yeah. So, I mean, the callousness is incredible, and nobody thinks to ask in this entire article, based on basically, you know, nothing. Supposedly calls to crisis centers have increased during this period. Again, not particularly surprising. All that means, I mean, I've worked at a crisis hotline. All that means is that somebody called up and said she was feeling fearful, or that she'd been, you know,
that's all it takes.
That's all it takes.
Threatened. She's recorded as a victim of violence.
Right.
Of course, all of these.
This is exaggerated stuff. It's really terrible. But you look at the fact also, United States issues something along the lines of 1 million ex parte restraining orders a year in divorce cases, none of which require any kind of evidence.
Exactly.
They're based on the emotions. Now, some women allege, yes, he's beating me. Sometimes it's true.
Mm-hmm.
Other women say he's beating me and it's not true. And some women just say, I'm afraid he's going to beat me.
Exactly.
And he's removed from the home.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. No, and it even says now they want to, some of the activists are calling for the waiving even of the court fee to get the restraining order or the protection order, depending on what it's called in various countries. So, they won't, whatever that fee is, they won't even have to pay that. And yeah, all that means is that a woman has to go before a judge and say, I fear this man. I fear him.
Right.
I knew a man who came back from South Africa where he'd been visiting his parents and found some of his clothes had been thrown by his wife into his car, and he was barred from his home. He was never allowed back into his home at that point. He had never been violent with her. All she had to say was that she feared him because he was a gun collector. He had guns in the house. They were mostly antique guns that didn't even fire, but that was enough for the police to tell him that indeed he could never enter his home again or see his children.
Trivial details.
Yeah. I mean, then that was the end of that man's life, essentially. He got $500,000 into debt trying to argue in court that he should have some access to his children. He was never able to pay that. And that was the end of him. So he lost his job. He spiraled into terrible depression and his health broke down. So this is the kind of thing that they're talking about. And to imagine that women are not going to be vindictive in the moment and use these special measures that are being put in place and use this heightened hysteria about threats to women, and then maybe even regret it, but by the time the protection order is in place, too late.
Because once the state takes over in those cases, this happens a lot of time. It happened to a professional athlete back in Houston some years ago, Warren Moon, quarterback for the Houston football team. His wife made a domestic violence accusation, later on calmed down about it and admitted that it was a mutual combat situation. They got into an argument. It escalated with both of them out of control. And she acknowledged her responsibility in that. And the prosecutor said, we don't care. Mm-hmm. We got a case against your husband.
Yeah.
That's it.
And once they get started on this, it's political for them.
And it's psychological. If you look at the whole moral typecasting thing, it's like the entire culture is geared to see women as victims. And the entire freaking culture is geared to see men as potential problems. And that happens automatically. People don't think about it. Our legislators are the same way. They're going to legislate to help women who's tied to the tracks, because of this whole moral typecasting thing. It's really important that we start broadcasting that out and letting people know that they need to check their own bias.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We're all biased like that.
Yeah.
It's not a good idea to get in between a human being and an opportunity to virtue signal about women sanctimoniously.
Yeah.
It's also not a good idea to get in between a person and their bias.
Yeah.
I thought you were going to say dangerous.
It certainly leads in this particular article to ludicrous statistics and claims being made as if they are evidence that anybody with a clear mind and a skeptical perspective would be able to see as ludicrous. For instance, it's mentioned at one point that in Cyprus, does this survey of all different countries. In Cyprus, we're told, quote, calls to a domestic violence hotline rose 30% in the week after 9th of March, when the island had its first confirmed case of coronavirus. Can you imagine if it only takes one confirmed case? That isn't even a death. It's just one person had the virus, and supposedly calls to the domestic violence hotline rose by 30%. What's it going to take when there's 100 confirmed cases? What's it going to be? I mean, and anybody who's ever looked at these kinds of studies knows that whenever you have a dramatic rise, it's highly unlikely that if domestic violence is the mass problem that feminists have been telling us it is, already, it's highly unlikely that 1 week into, one case being reported that there would be a 30% rise. That would only be possible if the baseline numbers are pretty darn low, but we never get the baseline numbers. We don't know how many calls there were on average to this domestic hotline and how, how it got to be the point that it rose by 30%. It's all just Like it's nothing, and yet it's presented as if it's really startling, hard evidence for what feminists have always said. And the other example that was really almost hilarious, though it's very disturbing in this article, was it mentioned that actually in Italy, the numbers of calls had dramatically reduced. But that was evidence of domestic violence as well, because the Italian feminist activists were quick to point out that that was because the women couldn't call.
Ooh.
Because their abusers were right there in the room or within earshot, but they were getting text messages from terrified women. But even so, they weren't able to actually say that the number of frantic text messages they received had actually indicated an increase overall, but they were sure that once the pandemic was over, they would be able to confirm that there had been a massive rise in domestic violence. So
leave it to feminists to turn to government during a time of absolute crisis when people are dying and say, "No, look at me.
Yeah.
Look at what I want you to look at." I just wish they would once just be honest and say domestic violence is increasing across the world because of coronavirus, because it fits my narrative.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because that's all this is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Crazy.
Bad stuff. Yeah, and the credulity of the general public, policymakers, lawmakers, etc., enables this kind of hysteria and hate mongering, and the result is that men's civil liberties, men's basic human rights, men's protections. I mean, you can imagine cases where a man is being abused by his wife, and he may end up being ejected from the home and having no place to go and being in an incredibly vulnerable state during this terrible time.
Exactly.
Anyway, yeah, so there it is.
Here we go on another happy note.
Yeah. So what do we take? What's our takeaway from this? I don't know.
Misandry sucks.
That we live in a misandrous society, and it's not going to change anytime soon.
Right.
Yeah.
Of course, that's about all there is to it.
And that it seems to be pretty much worldwide. I mean, they
Yes.
Interviewed in this article a police officer in China who'd set up a special charity for female victims of domestic violence, and it seems as if the feminist narrative is roaring along pretty well, supercharged in China as well.
Well, and China does not tolerate the ideological side of feminism. There's no gender studies or anything like that. It's just another proof that societies, whether they're conservative, liberal, left, right, whatever, it's all gynocentric, all of it.
Exactly.
That way, yeah.
Yep.
Speaking of gynocentric, in closing, I wanted to bring up a semi-related matter. I want to appeal to everybody, if you're watching this on an Ear for Men channel or on Studio Brule or on Tom's channel, to check to see whether or not you're still subscribed. And the reason for this is I've noted that my subscription count has been between 105,000 and 106,000 for a year. And what is happening is that the subscriber count builds, and once it starts getting too far north of 105,500, then YouTube starts unsubscribing people, and it goes right back down. I think they're having good fun with this. And as I understand it, it's also happening on the Brule channel and on MenAreGood, the same thing. I think it's almost just nearly impossible to maintain the exact subscriber count, especially when you have the numbers we have on the videos here. But please take a look, make sure you're subscribed to this channel, and to ring the bell, so to speak, to hopefully get notifications, because YouTube is censoring us in this way. They are manipulating the subscriber count so that you don't get notifications of these videos.
Correct. Well said. So please check it out and subscribe to all 3 channels.
So yeah, we get to end on 2 happy notes.
So stay safe, everybody. Look after yourselves.
And
Have a
remember,
good week.
Men?
are
Good.
we did it.
Wasn't sure if I was supposed to say R.
There was a debate going in my mind too. Who says R? I had a
where I like to
standoff
start.
with Janice.
Take
Oh,
care,
God.
everybody.
We'll see ya. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.